Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. Hope you had a good lunch. And the panelists have promised me an extremely exciting panel to keep you over the post-lunch sort of dreariness. So it'll be good. So this is a session on firms and the role of firms in growth. And it's moderated by Jonathan Mazumdar from Growth Teams. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
All right. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I know, yeah, we were just talking Friday after lunch. That's sort of a tough gig, but I think we have a really special panel lined up for you guys that'll bring everyone back, bring the energy back in the room. And so, yeah, we're keen to get into it. My name is Jonathan Mazumdar. I'm co-founder of Growth Teams. The focus of the session is firms, what challenges they face, and what can we do to help them grow. I think yesterday, Manish kind of helped calibrate our ambitions, right? His company, TeamLease, employs 400,000 people with aspirations to grow 4 or 5x. So similarly, we need businesses in Africa and South Asia that get bigger, resulting in more and better jobs. I think Ken also made a really nice framing point that firms are often kind of the specific beneficiaries that we need to design for in order to make policies and interventions that can drive broad-based growth and job creation. So all to say, I think firms are kind of where the magic is, where the magic happens. And so to help explore this, get clear and concrete about what we can do to support firm growth, I'm thrilled to be joined by a really amazing panel of thinkers and doers. So I'll only introduce you guys briefly, but we have Paddy Carter, Head of Development Economics at British International Investment, the British Development Finance Institution. James Foster, Insights Director at Gatsby Africa, an organization focused on sector transformation in East Africa. Radha Rajkotia is Chief Executive Officer of Building Markets, an organization that links businesses to buyers to help them grow. And Brendan Mullen is co-founder and managing director at Seicha Capital, a growth stage fund investing in traditional industries in Southern Africa. So I'm going to borrow a bit of a trick that Shruti used yesterday and start things off with a short question. So before we dive into the longer comments, I'd like to start by asking each of you to share in 1 or 2 minutes each, what do you see as the biggest obstacle or key factor in getting more large firms that create formal jobs at scale? And so let's hear the quick hot takes, and then we can move on to the longer comments. So we can go in order. I'll start with you, Paddy.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think we heard some of the usual candidates from Devon earlier, macroeconomic stability, mercurial regulatory and taxation regimes, and inadequate infrastructure. I couldn't tell you which of those is the most important, but I'm going to bring up a topic which I think is interesting, which is the issue of labour productivity relative to wages. This is a topic that actually CGD drew attention to a long time ago with a paper by Ramachandran, Gelb and Mayer that suggested that actually wages are not particularly low in Africa relative to wages. I'm about to start talking about something I don't really know a great deal about. This is all a bit anecdotal. But Ethiopia is a country that before the terrible war was doing everything right. It had the industrial policy, it had its factories, and as I understand it, the exports weren't properly taking off, and some of those factories were struggling to produce profitably. And we heard yesterday about the importance of pro-growth elite bargains and industrial policy. And you can have all those things right. You've got your factories in place. They're not profitable. You've got a big problem. So I don't know the answer here. I don't know if this is. I don't even know if this is really true. Like whether it's just a one-off anecdote from Ethiopia or whether it's a more widespread problem. But if it is, I think we really need to understand why it is and what anybody can do about it.
Brilliant. James?
Nice, thanks, Paddy. I guess large firms need large markets, and so regionalization, regional trade, that sort of stuff will help. The other thing is you need government support in the Messes Executives type of approach of solving problems. And you need, you need governments that are accepting of large firms. And all too often in the work we've been doing, governments are skeptical of large firms. They're worried about large firms particularly large international investors. We've got examples where we've had a great opportunity of a big textiles investment, and the government has said, oh, it's too big, we don't like them controlling so much, and it's gone away. $250 million investment lost for that sort of slight edginess around large firms. So I think that openness to large firms is probably key. Thanks.
Great. So thanks. Thanks for the question, Jonathan. So my view, so Building Markets focuses primarily on small businesses. So we work really with firms that employ no more than around 50 people generally, and are formal, but still small. And what we know about small businesses globally is that they're the most prevalent in terms of number. They're the largest employers in most countries. And in many low-income countries, they are also huge contributors to GDP. But they're incredibly difficult to access and support because of their number and fragmentation. But I would say one of the core things that we can do to support small businesses, and this is sort of the basis of our work, is really being able to address the market failure that exists around information, network, and trust between small firms and buyers within the marketplace, whether those are corporate, public sector, or even social sector buyers domestically and internationally. So I think if we're really interested in thinking about both firm growth and job creation or protection as a result of that at the SME level, at the small firm level, then really we need to think about market access that can help bridge and address some of those market failures.
Great. I think it's kind of evolved from very top-down, policy, market size. So maybe I'll kind of go bottom up. Within our portfolio, what we found, the companies that have kind of hit that trajectory of no longer a small business, no longer kind of just waiting, no longer just kind of like paddling in the water, but actually able to launch. It's generally cost of capital, and it's market share, so consolidation. Debt is expensive, and cash conversion cycles take a long time. You can get cheaper debt or cheaper capital some way, and then recycle that more quickly, and then start getting market share. So it does go back to that TAM, but also what we found is consolidation in a lot of these markets, and that's kind of where we hit that trajectory to create a lot more jobs.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot actually to dive into, but I think that, yeah, that just helps set the stage a bit, and we can begin to go back and forth. And I think, as we've said, we can, yeah, I'd love for you guys to actually ask questions of each other. But to start things off, Paddy, maybe we can kind of like, you can set the stage for us. Yesterday, Lant, sketched some of the facts of economic growth and poverty reduction. You've also written recently and extensively about how private investment into businesses has sort of indirect but very important effects on overall poverty levels. So tell us a little bit about that, why growth is important for BII's poverty reduction objectives, some of the common resistance or objections maybe you encounter about that link, and sort of how BII thinks about prioritizing investments for impact.
I mean, I think we all kind of agreed yesterday that in some respects this is a bit of a crazy conversation even to be having, trying to explain the importance of growth and firm growth and poverty reduction. But it is something that we continually struggle to communicate to our kind of stakeholders in the UK, if you will. I mean, the British government occasionally has parliamentary committees and development experts turn up to give their evidence. And they say things like, we shouldn't be investing in grid-scale electricity generation. We shouldn't be investing in fertilizer manufacturing capacity on the continent. So, there's still people that don't think what we do is development. So there is still this thing. And when we try and talk about the importance of growth and poverty reduction, the instant response, and it's not completely unreasonable, is that growth doesn't always result in poverty reduction, or at least the kind of response of poverty to growth varies across countries and across time. And so there's a sensible question about, well, okay, that's all right, that's fine. So what should we do then? What does that mean? Like, how, if you are trying to either invest or attract investment, with poverty reduction being your ultimate goal, what does it imply for you? And the response that we get to that question from civil society is that we have to direct our investments at extreme poverty in a very direct way, by which they mean the business has to employ someone that was living in extreme poverty, or it has to serve them. That's what and I kind of thought that that's not really what the experience of countries that have eradicated poverty show us. So the paper that you were kind enough to mention is called When Growth Does and Doesn't Reduce Poverty, and it was written with a team of academics. And what we kind of show there is, I hope I'm going to try and hide my face from Lard Pritchett if he's in here, because when I say this, it's not actually a case of if you can grow, poverty will look after itself. Many of the countries that were most successful, South Korea, they started with growth first. 5 years later, they thought, this isn't really working out as well as we wanted it to, and they started doing concerted efforts, programs of rural investment, rural roads, rural electrification. The reason we have this correlation between growth and poverty reduction is because governments take concerted efforts to use the proceeds of growth. This is when you do get a good response of poverty reduction to growth, to do things, to take economic activity into places where the poorer people are living. And the story is one of complementarities. So, we might, one of the things that a DFI could do is that we could get involved in the investments in larger firms that have the scope for economies of scale, big gains in productivity. But what we need to see happen is the government to tax those companies and then to spend the money on health and education. I mean, if you're someone that thinks that development is mainly about good things, education, healthcare, social protection, I've got a little statistic here. In low-income countries spend on average $5 per person on social spending. Lower middle-income countries spend $90, and upper middle-income countries spend $360 per person. So, you want to see growth for those reasons. And the problem is that if we're telling a story about complementarities and about lots of things having to happen together in the economy, a bit of a problem for us is if we invest in a port, this comes back to some of the things that were said yesterday about the desire to be able to say, this is what our dollar achieved. If what you're really talking about is something going into a system where the kind of effects are, we can't tell you when we invest in a port. We can't say there's 1,000 people over there that are now this much better off because of what we did. And I think that this is a bit, it's not really a problem for us because we are, after all, still investing in ports. But particularly like impact investors or people that come from this philosophy where impact investing is about measurable impact, I think that is a bit of a challenge when we're thinking about making investments where growth is the motivating thesis.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that for sure. James, in addition to support to governments, Gatsby Africa works directly with the private sector to promote transformation and upgrading in high potential sectors, primarily in East Africa. Could you give us a bit of a sort of overview of Gatsby's approach to that work, and maybe highlight 2 or 3 of the key sort of learnings that the Gatsby has had in trying to catalyze the growth of new high potential sectors?
Great, thank you. I guess to follow up on Paddy's point, we're a private foundation from the UK. We are a nano funder of nano funding size. We have £20 million a year to spend. We only work in East Africa, and we've evolved our approach enormously over the last 30 years. We started off doing ag research and microfinance and small business services. We did a bit of venture capital work, but now we focus entirely on sectors, industries, subsectors, whatever you want to term them. And we try to take a sort of holistic view on the sector, trying to look at how it can grow, how it can develop, where the big opportunities are, and what's needed to spur some momentum and kickstart change. So we focus on sectors for all of the good reasons that we've heard over the last few days, that you don't need a perfect business environment in the whole country for a sector to grow and develop. It can grow and develop with a little bit of targeted support, and you can improve the business environment for an individual sector without changing the whole system. Similarly, you don't need the political settlement to be totally ideal. You can work in a sector where the politics is okay, is acceptable, or it's a new sector, as Jonathan suggested, where you don't have such sort of political economy constraints. I guess secondly, we pick sectors quite carefully. We're thoughtful about how we get involved and when we get involved, and we haven't done that brilliantly, even despite our efforts at being thoughtful. We tend to try and work in sectors where the government has either asked us because they're really keen and committed to it moving, and then that is often not quite the case when you scratch the surface of the levels of commitment you need. Otherwise, we'd work in sectors where the private sector has got a much stronger role with less government need, and we can see real progress. So choose the sectors carefully, I suppose, was the second thing we do. Thirdly, we focus on transformational change. So we're aiming to create jobs rather than sort of support jobs. We're aiming to create jobs rather than add $50 of income to a farmer's pocket. So it's very much about trying to look at where investment is going to come from, where can investment come from at scale, where do you get, how do you get the businesses that can be invested in to be available. So it's working with those right kinds of business that Ken Apala was talking about yesterday, and trying to identify the right kinds of business is actually really difficult. It's particularly difficult for governments, but it's difficult for us even. You need to really understand the industry deeply to understand the markets, to understand the potential, to be able to say this is a business that's going to go somewhere and this one is not. And we've done a lot of work with businesses that are not and wasted money. And then I guess lastly, we recognize a lot of complexity. A sector is a system, an interrelated system that is always changing. And so we have to work in a really adaptive way. You work with one business, it changes something somewhere else, and then other businesses come forward. So we have to work very, very flexibly. We're a private foundation, so that's lucky. We can make decisions quite quickly. So what does it look like in practice? I guess we've worked recently in the forestry and wood product space across East Africa. BII has actually set up a fund in forestry with a few $100 million to spend on forestry. We're just in East Africa, so in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And we've been working at all levels of the value chain, from the production side, on the research into new species and which species can grow well and produce good trees, right through to prefab housing and low-cost housing development, and how we can get those sort of cross-laminated timber industry moving to provide the stock for housing and so on. But the business problems are enormous. We've got a lot of Chinese investment in East Africa in low-cost veneer production, so taking a fairly extractive type of industry and selling the low-grade veneers to China. But the government has put some pressure on, did a little bit of an export ban for a while, and now reduced that and made it a little bit more sort of time-bound and slower. But it is putting pressure on those firms to upgrade, and you're now seeing more vertical integration. We've supported a few firms to upgrade their processing. It's allowing more money to flow back into those people producing trees, so you're getting now a groundswell of production base increase and so on. Is it fully vertically integrated yet? Is the value chain all there? Are all the bits that you want to see operating? No. But is it getting there? Yes. And hopefully it will demonstrate to the government and to other actors that land allocated to forestry can do well in Tanzania particularly. It's got the right growing conditions and so on. So we're really trying to promote a sort of fully integrated industry that can create lots of jobs in downstream processing of furniture and timber construction for housing and so on, at the same time that's globally competitive and able to compete with what's currently supplying our industry of South African transmission poles and so on. So that's I guess how we work, and we end up working a lot with business, but choosing those right businesses is often tricky.
Indeed, okay. Actually, it's a nice follow-up. So, Radha, I want to bring you in here on thinking about the types of businesses. And so Building Markets aims to connect, as you said, small businesses to, in developing countries, to export markets. So maybe building on the regional and looking more widely, can you walk us through the case for how market access and exporting actually affects sort of, obviously, firm growth, but productivity itself, and some of the evidence in that area I think would be useful. And what types of interventions do you think have been most effective in terms of improving firm outcomes, and try to tell us about how that has also influenced the Building Markets journey and where you guys operate now.
Great, yeah. So we focus both on exports and domestic markets, but so I'll share a little bit on both of those. So first of all, I think just giving some context about market access. So in the SME space, just being candid, getting support in terms of philanthropy and development assistance towards SME growth is an incredibly tough area to sell, right? And it's tough because within philanthropy, I think there's a view that small business owners aren't necessarily super vulnerable, right? They're somewhat capable, they're productive, they're not the poorest of the poor, they're not the most at risk of being left behind, despite the fact that they may have, they may be from particularly, the lowest wealth quintiles in their communities. They're hiring people from those same communities. And what you see, that pattern you also see in terms of overseas development assistance. There is about 3% of overseas development assistance goes towards SME growth. And when you start looking at what those programs and interventions are focused on, the vast majority, over 50% of that 3% goes towards access to capital, and a remaining 15 or 20% on human capital development as well, so training programs. And so you're looking, and you can't even get the data on market access. It's not looked at. So I share this just to give a perspective on how underestimated it is in the kind of international view of what firms need to be able to grow. And that same pattern is also then mirrored in the evidence field as well. So if you look at, if you look up on JPAL, IPA, DFID, if you look across these big repositories of impact evaluations to try and understand, what rigorous studies have been done around firm growth at the SME level, there's hundreds, which is wonderful. But many of them are focused, again, on human capital, training programs, entrepreneurship training programs, and then also access to capital. There is a grand total of about 15 that are focused on market access interventions. And you can ask, why is that? Is it because people don't think it's important? But I would suggest that I think it's actually just because it's really hard to evaluate. It's really hard to design and carry out studies that connect buyers to suppliers at the levels of scale and sample and power that allow them to be useful in policy making and sort of meeting the standard of evidence that's required for decision making. So we have a bit of a challenge. We have a challenge of not necessarily knowing what the best things to do are. So we're relying on just a very small set of studies, so kind of snippets, individual studies, rather than bodies of evidence or bodies of experience to draw on to know what works. And then equally, there's not a lot of funding that's going into that, and there's not a clear sense of where that funding should be directed because it hasn't been clear historically. So for what Building Markets does, so we really lead with the hypothesis that that firms are able to meet the challenge of delivering what buyers require if they are given that opportunity. The issues around productivity, management, a lot of these things that training programs are geared towards, financial management, inventory management, certifications, these are very important things. But if they're not given the opportunity and the carrot of an opportunity in front of them, then those things are likely to be less effective. And so that's why we lead on the opportunity availability. So how do we make those opportunities available? One of the things that we really need to focus on is just buyers and engaging buyer interest and stimulating buyer interest. And so for us, for buyers, buyers who are interested in managing their supply chains and sourcing, they're not really interested in working with SMEs. They're interested in working with larger firms that are tested, that are proximate, that they may have through a referral or a recommendation. So an SME that is not known to them and potentially far away is a riskier and costlier proposition. So we take a very data-focused approach and really gather a lot of data about the small firms and then share that with, and play sort of a mediation role with buyers to be able to share data about these firms, what their capabilities are, what their past performance is, and where they may be able to meet a buyer's preferences. Now, in doing this, in terms of what are the kind of core constraints, often I think, I don't think we've heard very much at all in the last day about just the importance of language, right? So that language is a huge barrier between small firms and potential buyers, and particularly when we're looking at export markets. So when you're thinking about how a firm might be able to export with from Latin America to a firm in the US, without language skills, without English-speaking skills, then that's a proposition that's just not available to them. So something as simple as just being able to provide translation support. And now with technology that we have available to us, that shouldn't be difficult. But before that, it has been difficult. And it's been done through analog means, through teams of, dedicated teams who are willing to spend that time. But now we have a better opportunity to be able to address just some really basic barriers that are facing small firms. The other things I would say are in terms of what really helps is also just buyer preferences in terms of for small firms to understand what goes into how do you the other thing that that they're not good at demonstrating is just speaking the language of a buyer in terms of supply chain categories and product descriptions. So again, something very simple. When they have in their textile company, they may not have the right classification codes to be able to just describe and make that basic match. So we're not talking about necessarily changing the way they're producing their textiles, how they are manufacturing, shipping, any of those things. What we're talking about is can they even just describe it effectively in a way that's going to provide a hook to a potential buyer. And the last thing I would say is just in terms of once we make that connection, one of the things that we really need to see is, and we can talk more about this, is there is a need for working capital. So again, at that small firm level, we've talked a lot about investment. We get called by a lot of impact investors who are interested in using our pipeline of firms to be able to identify investment opportunities, which is great, but that really would speak to about 2 to 3% of our business network, whereas actually there's probably about 80% who have the potential to grow with the availability of working capital and would be able to then fill and become part of that pipeline or pool for potential future investment. And so I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that later. But I do want to say that, from our experience, what we have seen is that firms can deliver, small firms can deliver, and it doesn't need, and it won't be every firm, right? So we expect that from our network, it will be about 10, 12% who will actually be able to deliver, and the rest will be sort of working through that funnel of building capacity, building their past performance, so that then they would be ready for those supply chain interactions. And over the time that we've been working in countries, in fragile and conflict-affected countries through to low-income and middle-income countries, we have helped facilitate $1.4 billion in contract value for small firms. And so that does suggest that there is capacity there, and there's a great role for philanthropy to play in unlocking that for small firms.
Thank you. Brendan,
Jonathan.
it's a nice link, kind of this capital and knowledge to what I was wanting to talk to you about. And so, you've written about this arsenal of investor operators for Africa that complements financial capital to unlock the growth of high potential firms. So as an investor from that perspective in Southern Africa, tell us more about that idea. What's kind of the rationale behind it? And how does the Seycha Capital approach address the gap that SMEs often face between sort of the know-how and management practices required to fit into supply chains, reach customers at scale?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's nice to follow these esteemed colleagues. I think even following that, there's so much complexity in what we're trying to solve here. So we started with first principles. How do we get beyond that complexity? Well, let's get as close to the coal face as you can and give these businesses the best opportunities to grow. So that's the operator investor model. Succinctly, it's human capital arbitrage. We change the flows of capital from the best and the brightest on the continent. We find great companies to invest in. We give them capital, financial capital, and then we second these operator investors in there. So we steal from McKinsey and Goldman, and we put them into small businesses that sell wigs, make battery storage, work on farms. And it's been successful. It creates a lot of jobs and creates financial return. But maybe backing up, why this intervention? You can tell by my accent I am American. My co-founders are South African. So I'd done some VC and PE in the US, and then I went over to South Africa with Bain & Company and worked for some of the most esteemed VC and PE firms on the continent. And I was surprised that different market, different opportunities, different challenges are running the same playbook. Actually, I learned a term yesterday I'm going to use now. It was isomorphic mimicry. Like, why are we copying Silicon Valley or like LBOs in this totally different market that's grown differently? I mean, all the complexities and differences and opportunities that we've talked about. So we start with first principles. And in impact language, it is missing middle and management gap. In finance language, depending on who I speak to, it's financial and human capital arbitrage. So we try to be a little bit differentiated around where we invest, and I can speak about that later, but I don't want to go too long. But basically, we're not trying to do moonshots and get unicorns. Capital flows to the extremes. So it's that boring VC, micro PE. Companies that, I'll try and do one on y'all. Companies that are in a rut or sectors that are in a rut, and the companies that you can reinvigorate, upgrade, and then transform. But I digress. So the operator investor model was the biggest key. These are great companies, but it is very difficult to run a business, period. It's difficult to run a business in these markets, and it's way more difficult now than 50 years ago, right? Like, the average entrepreneur didn't need to worry about like installing Google Pixel and doing e-commerce attribution or the complexity of exporting, right? So we said these are great entrepreneurs. Let's give them the right to win, the best opportunity to grow, and we created Setra Capital, $35 million fund, so not big checks, but chunky enough. And then when we bring that check in, we second somebody else, one of those McKinsey, Bain, Goldman grads. Do they have the domain expertise? Are they ag experts or renewable energy? Generally not, but they are insecure type A's. And there's a lot of them on the continent, right? The last like 80% of our last 10 hires otherwise would have taken a job in London, in New York, and now they stay on the continent. So it reduces the brain drain, and it creates an excellent story for the diaspora. You can come back, you can have an amazing job. It's a de-risked way of doing entrepreneurship, and it's a lot of fun. I feel like I designed my dream job from when I was in my 20s, and now they get to live it while I get to speak on panels.
Brilliant. Okay, let's come back around, and then there's a couple of things that now have occurred to me that this link between large firms, small firms, the type of industry, and sort of maybe even technology will come to. But back to Paddy. Let's get into a little more details on BII. Building on sort of the conceptual basis and the argument you gave us, just share with us some specific examples of the different investment approaches or projects or instruments that BII is engaged with that sort of speak to this mission of promoting growth widely.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about three things. One is what we call internally economic enablers, which are investments where we expect there to be spillovers that result in many other firms making investments and improving their productivity. I'm going to talk about catalyzing markets, an awfully overused word, catalyzing, but it's most of us DFIs have in our thinking some sort of market creation thesis around some investments. And then I'm going to talk about qualitative aspects of finance, so not just supplying debt, credit constraints, but getting into the quality, the characteristics of the finance. But before I start talking, I think it's really quite a relief to be at an event like this and not be having to talk about blended finance and mobilizing. But there is obviously a lot of interest in mobilizing private finance. Everything I'm about to talk about works through firms investing not with our money. The kind of like the model is that we're going to end up with investment taking place. With some exceptions, nothing that I'm about to talk about is counted in mobilization statistics. So the whole kind of mobilizing private capital agenda is kind of missing what I'm about to talk about. So this first thing, economic enablers, I mean, there are different ways of approaching this. What I'm talking about here is quite close in spirit to, I think, growth diagnostics that were mentioned yesterday. I want to, because he's a friend, I want to promote his stuff. There's a terrific paper coming out by Tristan Reed looking at how to, I think, pick winners is the title, and it's all about trying to identify firms which are sort of technologically proximate to what you already do, but also have the potential for export markets and producing at scale. At BII, we've been particularly inspired by papers, by evidence. Charles Jones has a wonderful paper called Weak Links in Production Networks. And the idea here, you think about the economy as a production network, and then you have firms sell stuff to each other that they all use. And if you have some kind of weak links in there, intermediate goods, inputs to production that are not available, or they're low quality, or they're too expensive, they can really hobble the entire production network. And if you can fix them, you have big spillovers. And there's actually quite a lot of work now looking at the production networks and where to invest to get these positive spillovers. So we've operationalized that by more or less coming up with a list of types of business which we think we've found good empirical evidence for these spillovers. And all we ask of our investment professionals is that they go out and they try and prioritize investments in this type of business with one condition. We want them to also be able to tell us a convincing story that this thing actually is a constraint, it actually is a problem in the economy that they're investing in. So these are things like reliable and affordable power, cement, logistics, ports. Yeah, it's not rocket science, but it's a little bit different from how DFIs have previously thought, because DFIs have historically been a lot about what I'd call backward effects. Like what jobs are created in the production and the supply chain. What I'm talking about here is forward effects. So we're trying to think about what's going to happen as a result of the goods and services that the firms are producing. So that's one way that we use to prioritize investments that we think are going to have a big effect on growth. The other one is this idea of catalyzing markets. So most of us DFIs, we have this as part of our thinking. It's a little bit under the radar, really. I don't think it gets as much attention as other ways of mobilizing capital. Now, some of the bigger regional development banks, multilateral development banks, they're able to wrap around policy advice, regulatory reforms, the kind of work that you do, really trying to understand, think about like various things that need to happen. BII, we are more like we just give money to firms that want money, and we don't have like some of the policy sides that we can do. But what we're thinking about here is we're thinking about forward effects, spillovers, but it's not through the tangible outputs, it's through intangible things like knowledge creation and behavioral change. And that often means innovation. And it can be innovation at the level of the business, or it can be innovation at the level of the vehicle. But what I mean by the vehicle is we might, for instance, support the first venture capital fund in Africa that is solely focused on green technology. And what we're trying to do there is show that it's possible to have a profitable venture capital fund that is focused on green technology, and we're hoping that other people will copy it. I think a good example of what we do here is the EV market in India. I mean, it's really fascinating. Everybody else is talking about chargers. In India, it's battery swapping and three-wheelers. And we have a set of investments where we're in the three-wheeler EV manufacturers. We're backing the battery swapping networks. We're backing companies that kind of collect data about EVs to allow people who manage fleets to understand the value that they've still got left in their EVs. And then we've got people that finance EVs using that data. So I don't want to oversell it. I mean, if it is system thinking, it's system thinking of a fairly simplistic in a way, but we do try, and when we can, think about what it's going to take for a market to take off, and then try and find investments that work like that. And then the last thing I want to talk about, this idea of the qualitative nature of finance. So I have, and I think DFIs have, a deeply held belief that the supply of patient and risk-bearing capital to larger firms, medium-sized firms, large firms that have the potential for expansion. If you want to talk about what we can do to accelerate growth, this is really where the story is. Look, we don't have, I feel like I might get hit by lightning in this building if I say this. We don't have rigorous empirical evidence about that. There is no exogenous variation that an economist can use to identify the impact of a £10 million equity investment. So we are we are motivating what we do here by our understanding of how business works and what markets need. I'm afraid I'm going to promote a second paper that I've written. I have to justify my airfare. I'm sorry, we've recently published a paper called Investing for Impact in African Private Equity Funds. And this is an example of something that we think is very important for growth, but most people in development give them the horrors. I mean, private equity is, what? That's not development. You know, most people think of private equity as leveraged buyouts and operating hospitals and making them worse. Whereas what the kind of the private equity funds that we are talking about growth capital. We're talking about money being injected into businesses, not money being used to buy them off the previous owners and load them with debt. And it's not just about equity. We also, there's lots of very interesting non-bank lenders. They're not necessarily, they can be funds, they can be private credit funds, but they can be other structures as well. And what they're doing is they're putting more flexible, more patient money, longer term debt with the ability to sort of like have payment holidays and maybe have the repayments vary with the performance of the business, much more suitable for growth. We think they're very important, but the economics of these funds, it's really challenging. It's not easy to cover your overheads and your transaction costs from a small balance sheet, the returns on a small balance sheet. And also, DFIs don't like dealing with them because, you know, I mean, we would love to deal with a 250 million pound fund that can take a 50 million ticket from us, but we're not so interested in dealing with little funds that each takes like 2 million or 3 million off us at a time. Yeah. But it is a reality. And I think personally that there's just great scope for innovation and maybe a bit riskier. I think you could even make a case for temporary subsidies, like something to do to help these types of very exciting financing businesses kind of get off the ground and establish themselves and get going to the point where they no longer need subsidies. And what you talked about, I didn't know about this operator investor model, but I think that one of the things that you could do is that you could try and take some costs off these. Someone told me yesterday about fractional CFOs. You hire a. We could maybe do things where you kind of you cover a bit of their costs and make the economics of running these little lenders a bit more viable. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Right. Brendan, actually, go out of order slightly, but do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted
any of those things.
All great things. Maybe two things that jumped out at me. So the fractional CFO, we do use that, but I also want to be clear. Like with our operator investor model, we believe you need to be there like full time. This is a full time gig. You hear like, oh no, when I was consulting for KPMG, it would 6 hours a month. I would help out this small business in Africa somewhere. I'm like, that's not helpful. No. That is not helpful. If you're like an experienced person and offer advice, maybe, but like people need boots on the ground and help and owning an initiative and knowing when it's going to get done. And you need to be in the office to hear what else is going on and what's prioritized. So that, and yeah, we have tried to tweak fund economics by getting the operator investor model subsidized, because obviously you want a big team, but then you need a big fund. If you're a big fund, you have to write big checks, and that's not helping the small growing businesses. And also, I don't think that's where the returns are, and that's not where the job creation is, in our experience, at least in South Africa and Southern Africa, which is different. The second thing that you mentioned was a green technology fund, which I think is great. Any funds are good, but there's a unsexiness opportunity, and we are so pure sometimes in how we use development capital or investment capital in Africa, when there's so many services businesses, like boring businesses to use the term, that could use a little bit more capital, could consolidate, could grow, could create an economic multiplier, so that then that founder's daughter, she starts that green tech company maybe in 10 years, but then she'll have the capital behind it. There is not enough depth or breadth of capital to have funds or flows of capital be that specific, because then it's not agile. And when it's not agile, there's not going to be anybody that's going to buy them out sometimes. And when there's not enough depth, there's not going to be a follow-on. We can invest equity, but who's going to bring in the mezz? And we go to somebody like, well, sorry, our minimum check size for mezz is $50 million, or you're big enough, but we only invest in urban set companies, not rural. Like, we're getting a little too precious with the flows of capital, and I understand capital has constraints, but I fundamentally believe that's actually what's holding us back, is that it's when you and I also understand from economies of scale, you need to drop the $50 million or pound check as opposed to the 5. But if we can get a little bit more diffuse with that flow of capital, it'll find the right area. It'll be much more efficient. Easier said than done, but that's kind of my response on that. And that's what we're trying to do with our portfolio, which I guess to actually address the question.
If it's okay if I just do a very, very, very
Yeah.
quick response.
Can I just add a here
Oh, yes.
on what he just said before you jump?
I think if our kind of fund strategy, we definitely see a need for generalist funds, and there's a general lack of, like these lovely little super impactful VC things. They're only like one of a set of. We agree with you. We see a need for everything across the board.
Can I just ask you a question as well,
Yeah.
which is the level at which you're able to take that lens of broader market impact and the incentive structures of general finance institutions, is that as a fund manager in one of those institutions, you don't want to have a bad deal, and your focus is on the profitability of the deal. These sort of additional, you've presented a very good case, by the way, but the reality of the decision making of the fund manager, how realistic is it that they are looking at the breadth of potential spillovers from an investment or the real market drivers of the investment? When in the reality of their decision making, what percentage would you say is actually these bigger issues?
If I put myself in the position of a GP, a fund manager, I'm going to say close to zero.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that the people that we're invested in, what you want to do is you want to find investments where their profit incentives and your impact thesis are aligned. When it comes to the incentives within DFIs, I mean, we have some staff remuneration based on our impact score, and our impact score rewards people for finding investments that have these characteristics. But I mean, I'm sure you're right. Nobody wants to have their name associated with with a failed investment. And I think that in some areas like agriculture, we have examples where the business that the DFI invested in failed as an investment as far as the DFI is concerned, but it went on to kind of anchor a local, I'm sure DFIs have ambiguous feelings about it when that happens.
No, I'm sure. Absolutely. And the old CDC used to do real sector transformation work, building sort of 5 or 6 companies in the same sector to drive growth. And that's I guess, where we're trying to come in.
Good. That's actually what I wanted to ask you a little bit about. And it's kind of emerged from a few different points of, some firms are different, and so they may be due to the link in the network. It may be kind of because they're able to deliver on the demands of buyers. But you guys at Gatsby have done research on sort of this emergence of new sectors, right, in various countries, in cases floriculture in Kenya, salmon in Chile. We've talked about sort of Bangladesh and garments as a very famous story. So oftentimes in those cases, there's this sort of pioneer firm, right? Some key firm, and maybe it's actually then a cluster that plays some key role in igniting more widespread growth. And they have to demonstrate actually in that particular place, this activity is profitable, and there's some substantial risk associated with that. So maybe, what are some of the key takeaways on how to actually forge those pioneer firms? Like, what can we do as external actors?
Well, it's not easy. I think, if you look at the case we were hearing yesterday on Ethiopia and the industrial parks there, you look at the role PVH played in anchoring that ability of the government to borrow 250 million and invest in the park. It was crucial for that whole enterprise to take off, and you've now got 60,000 jobs in Hawassa Park and a big uptick in Ethiopia's exports. So these anchor firms can play a very, very, very important role. I guess it also talks to the point that when you're looking in a new sector or looking at a sector that exists, often the firms that you want to work with are not actually there. You can work with the existing industry, but the existing industry has stayed the size and scale it is because those firms are not growing for various reasons, and maybe because they don't have the right management capabilities, they might not have the right financial access, but often they might not have the right incentives to grow for various reasons. And so actually, a lot of the work we've tried to do in different sectors has been to create new business models or bring in new businesses from the start that can demonstrate sort of a new way of doing things. Whether that's the tea industry in Rwanda, where we essentially created a new business model by buying 2 tea factories together with the farmers, trying to replicate a sort of Kenya Tea Development Agency model, but in Rwanda. In Tanzania, well, in Kenya, in the region, we brought a management team in to set up a new fish farm in Kenya called Victory Farms, and we co-sponsored their feasibility study because we knew there was no fish farm in the region doing data-led management, producing fish efficiently, effectively, and cheaply that could compete with Chinese imports. And so this team have now set up. They've got a big farm operating. We had to co-fund their initial working capital because local banks didn't understand the business model. No other finance institution was willing to step in. Now you've had a few others coming on. They've raised another 10, 15, 20 million, and they're the largest farm in East Africa. 3 other large farms have come in and copied their business model. And now we're trying very hard to look at how do you get this sort of mid-tier of farms to adopt some of those better practices. But what's great about that is that you've seen the growth of these sort of production industries, and now you're allowing the investment in feed manufacturing, which is now something we've also helped to catalyze, and you're starting to see that sort of vertical value chain taking place. At the same time, now is the point at which we're going to the government and saying, look, this is happening, there's some momentum here, you've got to protect it. Because you need zoning in the lake, you need environmental protection, you need disease and fish health management and so on. And that's all the stuff that you'd like to start with that, you'd like to have that in place before you build an industry, but actually it's only going to really be feasible once you've got enough scale of an industry for it to be valuable to protect it. So the pioneering firms piece, I guess, for us, it's about identifying a market opportunity where there is scope for a large firm to come in and play an important role. It's then about identifying the right type of entity. If they exist, great, you can work with firms that are there, but otherwise you have to bring some in at times. And that's often tricky. And that leads to sort of some political problems. Certainly those firms, if they're internationally funded and financed and run, cause social problems locally, and managing all of that is very, very important and takes some effort.
Radha, following that, I want to return to you, and actually 2 questions, I think. One is sort of following on this, of how maybe an anchor firm or a large firm can productively engage with many smaller firms, and what that interaction might look like, and how that sort of could be mutually beneficial. So that's one, and then the other is sort of coming back to what you had referenced earlier around the possibilities for in addition to market access, or in complement to that, thinking about different types of finance and different tools that could be potentially related to, again, these contracts or engagements with larger firms. So kind of this dynamic or interaction that I'd love to kind of hear your perspective on.
Yeah, great. So on the firms piece, I think I'll give you an example. So we work in Colombia with, specifically there, we're focused on firms that are that engage people who have been affected by displacement. So a lot of migrants, a lot of internally displaced people. And we work across sectors, but we have a concentration in food and beverage and in hospitality-related industries. And so we've done quite a lot of work with hotel and supermarket chains in Colombia, and with the associations, the biggest associations there around that. Now, one thing to note is that I think, Colombia is a country where they've got incredibly complex public procurement systems, but have been making strong efforts to be able to make it more transparent, more accessible. Public SecOps, been in place for a few years in terms of publicly publishing procurement opportunities. There is no parallel to that in the private sector. So in terms of supply chain opportunities and purchase opportunities in the private sector, that is all still done very much through word of mouth and existing networks. So, so the first thing I think that's been really key to do, and we do this, we can't do this work alone. So we do this with the big trade associations of hotels, supermarkets, the business guilds, with the chambers of commerce, with the business promotion agencies as well. And I should stress that much of this work is also, it's really important to focus on both the municipal and regional level. And I think this is quite different in some ways, that when we're talking about small firms, we really do need to get down to that level. We're talking at mayor's offices, we're talking at municipal offices, very local chambers of commerce. And so, and again, this speaks to what I was saying originally about just the challenge of working across a very sort of fragmented and large volume of small businesses. But those opportunities in terms of consolidation and coordination for information sharing are really important. So we really take, we really take as incredibly, we take with great importance the role of our allies and partners and kind of coalition members when we're looking at a specific sector opportunity. In those hotels, so I'll take the kind of hotel hospitality area. That is, that's an area, for instance, where the first thing to be able to do is really just provide what the upside is in terms of variation, innovation that small firms can provide. And so one thing that's been really, really interesting and has worked really well is a lot of the hotels that we have in on the buyer side that we've worked with have been really interested in, for instance, how do you localize your minibar, right? So when you're thinking at the level of, they don't want to have Coca-Cola and M&Ms in their minibar anymore, but they want to be able to replace that with local Colombian foods, drinks, traditional sweets. That's a great entry point for local firms to be able to play a role, and it's bringing them into their network in a way that they hadn't done before. Now, that's a sort of purchase that I think that for a lot of hotels, they don't really want to be spending a lot of time sourcing those kinds of firms. And so again, that's when being able to provide data on vetted firms that we've already collected a lot of data on. We can give them information about their past performance. We can give them information that just takes some of that initial sourcing headache away for them. It makes it a much more compelling opportunity. Now, I've given you a very micro example, but you can multiply that across furniture, the actual construction materials to build hotels, what's in the gift shop, what goes to guests on their arrival, all of those things. So, and then also the support services that are provided. So you can really think about, in the experience that these buyers may have, where are the various entry points, and then thankfully, we have firms who can provide those in many cases. So I do think a lot of that initial engagement for the buyers is really just that initial vetting. That's the point at which they want the most sort of mediation, and then beyond that eases with time. In terms of the question around the financing, so here, I think there are, we see a lot of appetite from buyers that we're working with to actually put money into working capital funds. They're very happy to engage in supply chain financing for this. The challenge that we have, and this varies market to market, is just the cost of capital and the lack of flexibility on it in many cases. And we're talking about populations that don't necessarily have many other means or are perceived to be too risky from traditional financial institutions. And so there we do have to look for alternatives, so whether that's through corporate buyers or by working through private funds as well. So so that's been sort of a newer area that we've been focusing on in the last couple of years.
One last question, then we can open it up to the audience in a second. Radha, you had mentioned, this point on the evidence around market access potentially, that being limited, at least relative to some of the other areas that have been studied. Patty, you also kind of brought up this point that at some scale and some size of investing, that same type of evidence may be hard to come by. What can we do about that? What do you encourage sort of more exploration with? And how do we sort of make that case also to potential funders who have that expectation of certain type or framing of data and evidence? Whichever.
I mean, I think there's a really simple thing. I think that setting up. I spent a number of years working at Innovations for Poverty Action, and we found that one of the easiest way to draw research interest into under-researched areas was to set up a research fund. Is to just say, we will give you money if you can come up with good designs and find implementers. We've done this, a number of times. So I do think, it sounds obvious, but just making funds available, that this is prioritizing and signaling that market access is a priority area of interest, is a really simple way to draw both researchers and implementers, whether those are government, civil society, or private sector, into the space. I also think a second thing that can be done is looking where there have been compelling studies with promising results, replicate them. Let's replicate across markets, because at the moment, as I said, we've been looking, we're drawing on individual studies to be able to draw insights, which is dangerous. So for us to be able to replicate across geographies and really be able to start learning from bodies of evidence would be very valuable.
I think there is evidence, but it's a different kind of evidence. Well, my real job, everybody, is I sit in London and I read economics PDFs. I have folders and folders of papers, but what they're not is they're not an estimated treatment effect of an intervention. They are, we've looked across countries and over time, and we've got a model and we've calibrated it, and this is how important we think ports are. This is a paper about how important it is to make cement cheaper, but these will be maybe theory, calibrate. It's just a different type of evidence, and we just have to get people comfortable with looking at that kind of evidence rather than here's my project, I've proven my project did this, the type of evidence, and it's really hard because everybody wants us to have that type of evidence. But I think we just have to fight the fight.
So I would say, I'll push back on that only to say that at the firm level, that's why we've ended up with so much resource and policy attention paid to training for firms. And I'm not sure that because that is where the most evidence has been, and that may be misplaced.
Yeah,
I'd agree with you, though. I think it's on the same thing, but
Agreeing, actually.
On your comment, I agree entirely. I think one of the things that we see with development funding is that it looks for really detailed evidence of the success of a specific intervention. And I guess for us at a sector level, we're able to take a much bigger lens to this and to say, look, is the sector changing? Have the things that you said you were trying to do to change outcome level changes, have they happened? And then are you able to, as a result of that, assume that there's been some contribution from you to the wider change in the sector? That for us is good enough, but there are very few funders out there at the moment who are accepting of that level of sort of proof, if you like, of attributable change, and I think we have to, in the sort of complex systems where you're trying to work in with business and the business community and the whole sort of policy sphere as well, you've got to accept slightly more contribution sort of changes rather than this sort of, have we proved the nth degree of attribution? Sorry.
Yeah. Great. I think let's open up to questions. So yeah, we have the microphones. Start by saying your name, and then let's keep it brief. And then please don't forget questions should end with a question mark. So the gentleman over here in the jacket, Devin, and we'll go with Karthik.
Hi, a great panel discussion. Neil Gregory from ODI. Very glad to see the focus on the importance of large formal firms affecting change from so many discussions. But when you look at the size distribution of firms, particularly in low-income countries, what you find is there isn't a missing middle, there's a missing top. And I did research, led research when I was with IFC, which demonstrated this for a number of countries. So the question to the panel is, given the importance of large formal firms, and there aren't enough of them in many of these markets that you're working in, where are these new firms going to come from? And I won't allow you to answer from SMEs, because we also debunked that myth. Most small firms do not grow to become large. Most large firms start large. So how are we going to solve for the lack of large firms in most of these markets?
I actually have a very complimentary question to that one. So my name is Devin Chesney. I'm with the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, part of the Aspen Institute. And I think using the term firms here actually, it masks a reality of this work that I'm curious for people's thoughts about. So we talk about entrepreneurs. The difference between an entrepreneur and a firm is that entrepreneurs try many times usually before they're successful. And we also use a term called small and growing businesses, which sort of pulls out of SMEs, the ones who actually have a growth-oriented mindset and are looking to address a market opportunity, similar to the distinction about different, like livelihoods entrepreneurs or necessity-based entrepreneurs are a very different category, and we try to exclude them. So everything I'm talking about is about these growth-oriented businesses. But we know, for example, that the average successful entrepreneur who reaches any kind of scale is on their third business. Right? They failed twice, and the third time they figured it out. They're also on average 40 years old, so they've had some industry experience somewhere along the way. And so I wonder how you think about, like, one of the constraints to finding good growth-oriented firms that become large is the number of entrepreneurs who set out on that journey at all with a growth-oriented mindset, right? Because most evidence says you need about 10 small firms to get one medium firm, you need 10 medium firms to get one large firm, and so you need 100 to start to get one. And the system doesn't often have the resources in it to support people in that journey as an entrepreneur to try and to fail. Because, I mean, all of the panelists are doing amazing work, but you all talked about trying to find winners rather than the ones who will fail, right? You're trying to avoid working with the ones who will fail. Somebody has to give people a chance to fail so that they will learn and become a successful entrepreneur. We tend to think that should be development agencies. They should be paying for the public goods that allow people the opportunity to fail and learn so that you will get a stronger pipeline. But I'd be very interested to hear about the panelists' thoughts there.
Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Nerland. I previously settled securities, just quit my job, considering maybe doing impact investing. So as a part of that, my question is, like, as a quant trader, where are the resources that you're saying for public goods that I could look for? What places have been successful? Where's the data? Is there like a public good that is, all the successful places that have gone along and what are, and you said it's very high cost of capital. That sounds like to me as an investor, there's a lot of opportunity here. Why isn't there a lot of opportunity if they have a high cost of capital?
The high cost of capital thing, I mean, I was at an event recently with Nigerian entrepreneurs saying, I'm getting charged 45% interest. I'm not going to borrow at 45%. The reasons why the interest rate is 45% in Nigeria are not, I think, because there's, I don't think it's a reflection of,
like a real, like an effective cost of capital after.
Oh, okay.
After default rate, after inflation, like I understand Nigerian.
Okay.
Local U.S.
I misunderstood, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm a bit stumped on how to answer your question in that case, I'm afraid. I don't really have a good answer to you. And I think on the large firms, I mean, I've tried to answer a little bit of that already. I think another thing maybe is also that DFIs, we have to be additional. And maybe these businesses that we're setting up in Morocco to manufacture cars don't really need a DFI to help finance them. And then sometimes when we do work with the very big firms, it's very hard for us to communicate why we were needed. And the example I have in mind is that we invested equity with Vodafone and Sumito and, I can't remember that, Safaricom, of course, to bid for the first license in Ethiopia. And that resulted in not this particular investment, but the whole liberalization process resulted in data prices, tumbling in that country. And if you can think of investment that has a great positive impact in terms of like the change in people's incomes, it's fantastic. But most people reacted to that saying, what the hell are you doing? I mean, Vodafone can get all the money they need, surely. And we have to try and explain to people that even Vodafone don't want to go into Ethiopia unless they've got someone sharing some risk. And it was not just about the risk capital, it was also about the UK government and how we could help out there. So I think we sometimes face challenges dealing with the very largest firms because it's kind of hard to confidently find our place with them, if you see what I mean.
I think we can agree very much. It's a great example. Where we've seen trying to get large firms in, that $250 million investment I was talking about, you know, it did need a bit of government support to land it. And that wasn't forthcoming because they had the zone demarcated, they had the approval that this was what it was going to be for, and yet they didn't want that one firm to control the whole zone. And so it was so frustrating where we had brought them in, we'd got all the investment promotion work done, and the business case and the market opportunity was all there, but it was too big. So that's deeply frustrating. I guess on the, so I suppose the point is you can get investment promotion going, but it's, it needs to be really aimed at large firms from the start. And the pioneering firm we talked about in aquaculture, we've now done the same for fish feed. And that's great. It's changed the dynamics of that whole industry with the other large firms doing feed in the region. Allowing firms to fail, alongside this large firm investment in aquaculture, we did work with 20 medium-sized firms in the aquaculture space, of whom probably 5 will be profitable long-term and survive, and 15 won't. We probably spent too long with the ones that weren't going to make it. We wasted time and money and effort with them, but we wouldn't have known that they weren't going to make it up front. Almost impossible to do a sort of ex-ante decision over which ones are going to make it and which ones are not. You've got to work with them to see how quickly people listen and engage and try and take on their own version of what's good practice and so on. So I think we have to be, as you said, we have to make that effort, but probably we wouldn't do 5 years of support. Actually, it was only 2, but even then 2 was too long. And actually what we're doing now is we're now looking for entrepreneurs that have got some experience in agribusiness, got some experience in sort of business management in different fields that we can bring into fish farming in the region in East Africa. Because we think that with an agribusiness background, you'll actually already be ready to go and think bigger and have that data-led management practice sort of sewn up pretty quickly. So looking to get the right entrepreneurs in from the start, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the Victory Farm, I don't know as well as you, but the Victory Farm's example is fantastic, and we should make that more well known. Maybe y'all are working on that. I mean, I know it from afar. It's also messy, right? It took a while. It took a lot of CapEx. It took way more investment than was the plan, but it's a huge success story. And I think what you can learn from that is, you know, that was built for the local context. So is it modular? Is it replicable? I think so, but it also takes hard yards. And I think it goes to both the questions about the large firms in small income countries. I think my perspective is mostly middle income countries. So can you create a model that you could stand up in those 2 different country examples, but would be, you know, thinking about the local context? And that's what we found to a degree with our portfolio. I'll give 2 quick examples speaking to the size of firms and the human capital component of the entrepreneurship. Is that so we invested in a battery storage company, right? Because there weren't a lot of local battery storage manufacturers in South Africa. And now we have a lot of large multinationals sniffing around trying to buy us. And they're going to be entering South Africa via our battery storage company because they need that step in the value chain. We had a local advantage of manufacturing and software built for South Africa, so it was helpful for them. We are going into other markets, but it's very hard. We're trying to crack Zambia right now. We can talk later. So, you know, that was able to attract a large firm. I don't know if it's the full answer, but yeah, different market, right? We keep using Malawi as the example. It would be different in Malawi. We would go about it a different way. Maybe franchising, you know, it would be a different model. But yeah, keeping it modular and replicable. And then speaking to the entrepreneurship, I mean, there's so much thought there. I'll just kind of pitch our book, you know, pitch my book with Secha, is that this operator investor model is a very de-risked way of doing entrepreneurship. And, you know, we kind of borrow from the search fund asset class that I know you're well aware of. and kind of larger private equity value add teams. But it's hard to tell, so Molefe, he's a McKinsey grad, graduated HBS. Hard to tell his parents that he's going to start a business despite this, they're like, stay at McKinsey, like stay at this, but now working with us, he has the kind of the pedigree of a Secha Capital, a fund, and he's going to go buy a business, a medium-sized business, and make it large. And it is that elite bargain that we were discussing yesterday that, these operator investors, they go on to start businesses. They go on to join large businesses. They've now seen what good looks like. They share their capabilities with those small growing businesses, and then they go on to do it again and again. We hire them at 25, 30. So by the time they're 40, maybe that's when they start their business. But I think a de-risked entry into entrepreneurship is key because we can handle losers. Secha, we're going to make 15 investments in this one fund alone. We can have a few losers, as you say. But Molefe, he's only got one shot, really, at least his perspective at 30 years old. So we got to help get it right the first time.
Maybe one pitch for additional research, which is that one of the big foundational sort of thinkings, I suppose, that we have in terms of where growth will come from as well is existing employees of those large firms. And if you look at the Bangladesh garment story and so on, you've heard it ad infinitum that these are the ways that people come out of these large firms with the experience and able to then apply that in their own context. I guess it'd be really nice to see skills building programs think about that, and actually assess that. And I don't know, I haven't seen much on it, but is that something that we could then use to tell some of those stories of that we're investing in this firm, but it's the spillover effect actually is going to be through its employees leaving. And are there schemes to encourage that? Can you actually do like some of the black economic empowerment schemes in South Africa where you drive an encouragement of certain types of suppliers? And I don't know, there's something in that maybe that could be a way to go. But I mean, we're certainly hopeful that that's what's coming from the textile and garment industry. But we haven't obviously seen it yet.
Rahel, anything you want to add on? I was thinking of your sort of the funnel that you have.
Yeah, I was like, well, I feel like a funnel is fairly self-explanatory, but the funnel does mean that we don't expect, this is a journey. We're not expecting small firms to all be ready for their first big procurement opportunity or supply chain opportunity. There's a subset, about 10%. Plus that would make that. But even getting to that point, we did an analysis of firm survival for about 5,000 of the firms that we work with in the Middle East, and there one of the core things that promoted survival, one, multilingualism. That was a huge driver of survival, and a second thing was diverse market access routes, right? So are they using domestic? Are they using digital? Are they exporting? And if the more avenues they used, the more likely they were to survive. And so when we're thinking about this journey, we might be working with a firm that's saying, yeah, I only work domestically. And so our first step with them is to say, okay, well, have you considered digital? Let's work with you on that. So they may not be ready for the full set of most complicated, highest value transactions, but it's a bit of a journey to get there. And what we find, what's exciting, is that once they're there, the firms that we've worked with that engage in procurement opportunities, once we've worked with them once, they will repeat 6 to 8 times in several years beyond that. So, we see really positive, there is a positive trajectory, but clearly not everyone is going at the same pace, and that's okay. So, and some don't want to grow, and will also pull back, and that's also okay.
Let's take one more round. Questions? Karthik, and the woman over here.
I'm curious to hear more about when you actually fund some of these larger formal firms. We've heard about how important market access is. I think that the question is, when you have these large or medium to large businesses, are they exporting as well? Are they being able to sell in foreign markets? Are there barriers to doing so? What are they? Would like to hear more about that.
Go over here. Let's take a couple. Yeah, one. There was one over here. Yeah.
Excuse me. Hi, Nancy Lee from Center for Global Development. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this small versus large firms, innovation, and venture capital. So we know that in advanced economies, some of the largest firms didn't exist 30 years ago. So to get to large transformational firms, you've got to start with small, young firms that are innovative. A lot of them don't succeed, as has already been said. We know that innovation is designed for rich countries, doesn't necessarily work for poor countries. We know there's not a lot of support for domestic innovation, and diffusion of innovation doesn't work all that well. So it would seem, and this is going back to Patty's point about investing in venture capital funds, that investing in venture capital funds has potentially very large positive spillover effects. There are capital market gaps. They don't they don't exist. Those markets don't exist necessarily. And the firms that they invest in have huge, some of them, some minority of them have huge growth and job creation potential. So, and from my experience working at the IDB lab, which tried to invest in venture capital funds maybe 15 years ago, in the early days it failed. And when it succeeded, the returns were somewhere in the single digits. So it's very different. It's below market returns. So it seems to me that if you're going to talk about what DFIs and MDBs ought to be doing, it's not unreasonable to suggest that they be venture capital market builders and accept these below market returns so that others can reap the higher returns. So that's a form. I'm going to bring up blended finance, Patty. Sorry. That's a form of blended finance, it seems to me, that has a lot of potential and is scalable and could be very impactful. So what's your reaction? That's my question.
Patty, want to give that to you?
Yeah, and I should have really answered you as well, which is that anything which is like, oh yeah, we can have loads fail, but we'll make our money on the ones that do well. Obviously, that has to be some sort of instrument with upside participation. If you're talking about debt, you can't say I'm going to lend loads, but when you go to the smaller firms, it's very hard just to buy ordinary shares in a small business in Sierra Leone and then find someone to buy it back from you 5 years later. So I think there is a lot of need for innovation of kind of instruments that have that kind of upside participation, but also kind of self-liquidating and that kind of stuff. The VC thing, I mean, again, that kind of model, you lose money on 80% of your investments, but to make it back, you've got to go like, 10 times, 20 times, 50 times on the ones that win. And there's lots of businesses that just don't have that potential. You've got businesses that they might do well, but you'll make money about 3 or 4 times if they do, and that's not enough to compensate you for having a lot of losses in your portfolio. I guess it is a form of blended finance if you are simply a DFI and you are willing to have a portfolio of equity investments where you make sub-commercial returns on average, and you just wear the losses on your balance sheet, and then the ones that succeed prove themselves, you sell them to someone in the private sector, and that's how you mobilize. It wouldn't be counted in mobilization statistics either. But the problem is that you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, which is that if you just say, we're DFIs, here's what we do, we invest in funds that don't make any money, also you're wanting to establish funds that are going to make money and be sustainable and attract money by themselves. So we've got to kind of find ways of doing all those pieces, I think. And you want kind of stories of graduation and being able to. I think it's quite hard for us just to go in with a we plan to lose money thesis. In fact, most of us DFIs don't have the ability to do that. Our wonderful shareholder has recently given us the ability to do negative net present value investing if circumstances justify it. And I'd also actually point to AgDevco, which has just been given some money from the British government, again, to put equity into medium-sized firms where you're not going to make VC-like returns from the ones that win. And again, they'll be accepting sub-commercial returns on that portfolio. So I agree with you, it's really important.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think a very good question, and I'll get to the other one. Maybe with the headline, just starting with narrative violation. Like, we shouldn't call it venture capital, right? For the most part. I mean, it exists, but yeah, that's it, because we shouldn't be shooting for 80% fail and power laws and quoting, Silicon Valley. It's just, I think it's a little bit silly. I mean, it exists and it can work, but that shouldn't be take up as much space as we have here. And so I guess that is my opinion. And yes, it's Secha. I mean, our portfolio, we've gotten dividends, like from profit, dividends that return our investments. We've done management buyouts, vendor financing, dividend recaps, secondary sales. And then, yeah, I'm interested in revenue-based financing. I'm still not sold. I think it just comes around to debt again anyway, but at least it's a little bit more innovative. In terms of blended finance, I call it complex finance. And it's generally like people that know how to access it and are willing to do the paperwork and the M&E. And then suddenly 80% of your bandwidth is focused on this, and you're not investing your IR, your investor relations. Still good. One of our funders, SASME Fund, has a first loss with USAID. I think that's clean, that's easy. Blending finance, it's complex. I haven't seen it nailed, and it's not flowing the way we all expected. So I'm not sold on it yet. I wouldn't turn it down, but just don't overload us with M&E, a term I didn't even know 5 years ago. Right? So yeah, I really go back to that. Yeah, in a few years, Africa will be a quarter of the world's population, and we have 5 basis points of private capital. I mean, I go back to that. It needs more. It will only get more and help the DFIs out if we have returns. So I guess I go to that. Like, we need to be have a few funds, make money, show a really good IRR. Don't do it in dollar terms. Do it in local currency terms, because that's another constraint. And then have anecdotes like Victory Farms, like Native Child. I'll name more of ours, but like Victory Farms. And maybe that's a good segue, a very different question. But yeah, we would love almost all of our companies to export. Some of it makes more sense. But once you get into exporting, then you have to deal with cash conversion cycles. And we're talking now supply chain logistics. We actually just invested in a company that does it for perishable foods. The leaky buckets getting your product from Joburg to London. I mean, a piece of fruit is touched by 27 different hands, and that's why food is so expensive. So we always I guess maybe lastly at Secha, we would never invest in a company expecting only an export market, because it's a game changer. One of our companies, Rush Nutrition, they got into Walmart, and that one drop shipment was 3 times our revenue the previous year. So it's there and it's in dollars and we love it. But then if they don't pay us for 90 days, we are broke. And we'll talk about back-end trade spend and all that thing from retailers another time, but it's tough. It kills your margin. So while it's great, it isn't always the panacea that it looks like at first.
I think we're almost at time. Radha, do you want to?
No,
I don't have the last word on that one.
I'm good, thank you.
James, it looks like you might.
I'll just say one point on the export stuff. In essence, yes, the large firms that we're investing in are either globally competitive to imports coming in or they're exporting. I think one of the challenges for us is that it's not always easy for them to be replicated. So we created this lovely new model of tea factories, farmer-owned tea factories in Rwanda, but to replicate it, someone else has then got to put money up front to buy a tea factory on behalf of the farmers and manage it really well for them and then hand it over time. And actually, that model was pretty flawed in terms of its ability to be adopted by others. What has been adopted is some of the good practices and so on, but the Victory Farms one is one that is working. It is showing an opportunity for others to copy and replicate the mimicry that we're looking for in some cases.
The good kind.
Yeah, the good kind.
Okay, amazing. I think we're at time. So thank you. We could go on for a long time, but that was great. Thank you guys. Okay, yeah, we have a 30-minute break. Coffee's outside, and then we'll come back for our closing session with Stephen and Leonard.